I bring good news, news of salvation that comes through Jesus Christ. There are no better news than Jesus rose again. Jesus came back to life. So because of his sacrifice and his resurrection, we can have hope. Because of his death and resurrection, we have a future. We have nothing to fear. Have you ever thought about like many great leaders, people who are considered prophets, like a wise man or woman, and they actually influenced like many other people, and they were marked in history. Some of them performed miracles. Some of them died for their cause. But Jesus is different because one simple, and when I say simple, I'm being full of irony, because the difference that Jesus has among these other prophets and leaders and influencers is that he was the only one that rose from death. They could perform miracles. They could even die for their cause. But Jesus not only died for that, he came back. So there is this thing that set Jesus apart from any other important figure in history, and that's resurrection. He didn't just live. He died, and he didn't just die. He rose again from death. So I just want to bring you to Jesus' life, death, and resurrection in this morning and think about this journey. And my idea here is to answer some questions as why did Jesus have to die? Is there any other way that we could be saved? Also, is the resurrection truth? Do we have evidence for that? And if this all is true, what difference it makes in our lives today? So I don't know if you heard about Lee Strobel. He was a journalist and he didn't believe in Jesus' resurrection. And he started to interview and look for proofs that he could just say this is fake, this did not happen. And as he was researching and interviewing people, something incredible happened. He was finding evidence actually that contradicted his first thought. And he actually became a believer, and he wrote a book called The Case for Christ. So his book has influenced many people that didn't believe in Jesus, and they came to believe. The records are clear. When you look back to history, there was a man called Jesus from Nazareth, and he was crucified. He lived here on earth, and he died. So this is no questionable. If you go for history and in Roman, you can find Tacitus, who wrote about Jesus. You can find in Jewish history, in Josephus, that he confirmed that Jesus existed. What people try to do, they try to separate the Jesus, the historical Jesus, a man who lived in Nazareth, in Galilee, and walked in Jerusalem, from the Christ of faith. The second one was created by Christians. This is a second character that was created by imagination. And this Jesus, this historical Jesus, was a good man, was even a prophet. But this Christ of faith, that was the one who performed miracles, who rose again. And they try to separate these two figures. But when you go to history, you can confirm that Jesus actually exists, that Jesus actually died. But when we go to Bible, there are some things. There is a little bit deeper than that. Jesus was crucified, and that was something that was reserved for the worst kind of people. You know, the worst criminals. It was painful, and it had the intention to humiliate the person who was upon the cross, who was hanging there. So it was like public. He was naked. And it brings the question, who was responsible for that? Or maybe who did kill Jesus? You know, there are some people that they believe it was the Roman leaders because they gave the sentence. There are another group that will say that was the Jewish leaders because they actually brought Jesus to Pilate and to be judged by them. But there is a text in the Bible. In John 10, and Jesus is explained to his disciple, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, I know the Father. And Jesus says, I lay down my life for the sheep. Verse 18 says, no one takes it from me. I lay down of my own accord. So the shocking news is that this humiliation, this public exposure, this death that was brutal, that was painful, was chosen by Jesus. He went there willingly. He gave his life. You can say that was the Roman Empire, that was the Jewish, but Bible says that Jesus came with this purpose. He came to die. So, if you have to point some fingers, you can start by yourself. Because Jesus came to die for our sins, to pay the price of my sin. So, I am the responsible one. You are. Jesus came to this earth knowing what he had to do. But why? Why he had to die? Imagine that you are in a courtroom and there is a guilty son before a judge, and the judge is his father. And now he's being accused of some crime that he actually committed. What will the judge do? He will keep the law and condemn his son, or he will love his son. So he's between law and love. So what he will do? So the story says that he gives the sentence. He says, you have to pay this amount that was really, really high. The son could not pay that. But that was the law. But then he stepped down, he hugs his son, and he says, I will pay for you. So the law was fulfilled, and the love was still there. And that's exactly what Jesus did. Someone has to die for the sins. But there was still love there that Jesus said, you're not going to die. I'm going to die for you. The desire of age. There is a quote that says, Christ was treated as we deserve, that we might be treated as he deserves. He was condemned for our sins, in which he had no share, that we might be justified by his righteousness, in which we had no share. He suffered the death which was ours, that we might receive the life which was his. So that was a replace. Jesus said, I will take your death, I will pay the price, then you can share life with me. Could we be saved in another way? No. The price was too high that only God could pay it himself. That only Christ could pay this. So even you couldn't pay the price of your own sins. So Jesus had to die to offer salvation for us. But as I said in the beginning, he could be like just a good prophet. He could be just a good leader. and died for that, but that wouldn't prove anything. Because the death was the first step, but it requires the death of someone who was God, someone who has power, who has authority over death. And Paul says that without resurrection, our faith would be vain. So resurrection, it's actually the victory over the sacrifice. So, again, is the resurrection a historical fact, or is the resurrection something created for this crash of faith? Something that Christianity, after many years, just invented, just bring to give some hope, or maybe to make a story better, look good, out of the disappointment of the death of his leader. So there are some historical evidence for resurrection, and there are some like spiritual evidence. But I'm gonna start with the historical. The first one is the empty tomb. You know, all the four Gospels testify that the tomb was empty. There was no one there. Even the leaders, even the opposition, they start to create stories about the empty tomb. Said, oh, someone got the body, someone tried to rob that. But this is a fact. It was empty. If the body was still there, the authorities could just have, like, show the body, and then Christianity would end. All the story would end right away. Say, no, Jesus' body is here. We've recovered it. Someone had hidden or had stolen that, but it's back here. And they never found it. The second one is that 1 Corinthians says that over 500 people saw Jesus alive after his crucifixion. So there were many witnesses, including people that didn't believe, including Thomas, that was the doubting disciple, and some people who were actually in the opposition, and they were trying to explain that, but they couldn't. Another one is that the first witness, they were women. And in that century, in that context, they were not considered like reliable. And this is one thing that in the beginning people didn't understand, why would it be women that was the first witness. But as the time was passed, people started to make sense, because if this story was not real, they would just change to make that more reliable. Because if you are inventing a story, you wouldn't put something that was not reliable. You would make that in a way that would be the most reliable one. You would probably put a rabbi. You would probably put someone from the high society, someone who would be reliable. But by the fact that the first one, and it's in the Gospels that it was Mary of Magdala, you can see that there is no reason they were inventing that. There is no prophet, and put someone like her to be the first witness to see Jesus. Another thing is that after Jesus ascended to heaven, they start to preach the proclamation and proclaim the resurrection. So it was imminent there. It wasn't something that they started to create centuries later to see, oh, we need a powerful message or something like that. It was right away. And the last one for me, it's one of the most convincing one. It was the transformation of the disciples. Before the resurrection, they all ran away. When Jesus was arrested, everyone left him. They were hidden behind locked doors. you can see that there is something that is really interesting, that when they were eating the bread and the wine, Jesus said something, that one of them would betray them. And what shocks me is that they didn't say anything against it. They didn't just stand and say, Jesus, what are you talking about? No one here will do that. That's impossible. You are the Messiah. We are here with you. They didn't do that. What they did, they start asking, could be me? Will that be me? Because all of them knew in their heart there was a possibility that they could betray Jesus. Actually, there is one disciple that said, I would never do that. There's one disciple that looked at Jesus and said, Jesus, if I have to die, I will die for you. And Jesus said, I don't think so. Tonight you're going to deny me 3 times. And you know the story. In that night, 2 disciples actually betrayed Jesus. Judas and Peter. You can see Peter afraid. You can see Peter denying Jesus for a girl that I would believe it was in junior high. And he was so afraid. And he was denying Jesus. And said, no, I don't know this man. But then, just few years later, you're going to see the same Peter who was scared, who was denying Jesus, now before authorities, before torture, before threatening of his life, saying, Jesus was here. He rose again. He's alive. To the point that his transformation said, if you keep going with this story, if you keep going, you're going to be crucified. And he said, Jesus is alive. And if you have to crucify me, just put me upside down, because I'm not worthy to be crucified the same way that my master was. So the transformation of the disciples was so powerful that people who were once terrified became bold enough, even before death, to keep the story going. I don't know if you have heard or read about the Watergate scandal. And Chuck Colson once said about that 12 men kept alive for 3 weeks and they could not hold it together. They could not say the same thing. But yet, the apostles suffered torture and death without denying Jesus' resurrection. It must be true. He said that they preached for 40 years under pressure, torture, and persecution, and they didn't change their story. There is only one reason for that. They know what they saw. Ellen White says that his resurrection is the pledge of our own resurrection. Because he rose again, we have hope for the future that one day we're going to rise again. What does information actually change today in my life and in your life? If the resurrection is real, and I believe with all my heart it is, it should transform me now. So what difference that's going to make on Monday morning when your weekend is over, when you actually are not in the church and you are living your day-to-day life? The first thing, I think you can live a life without fear. It gives you courage to face our fears. Think about it. If death itself has been defeated, what do you have left to fear? Our greatest enemy has lost his power. It remind me about a story of a little girl called Emily, and she was afraid of rain and storms. And one night it was raining a lot, like thunderbolts and all the noise that rains bring. And she was scared, and she called for her father, and she said, "Daddy, I'm so afraid." And he comes to her room, and then he said, I'm here, I'm right here, you are safe now. And she asked, "Daddy, you are not afraid of rain?" And he said, "No." And then she said, "If you are not afraid, I won't fear either, because you are here with me." You know, if Jesus conquered that, if he won, that's the assurance that we're gonna win again. We're gonna win with him. We don't have anything else to fear. The second is that we can live a life with purpose. You know, you're not an accident. You are actually designed for eternity. Resurrection gives us purpose. Your life isn't random or meaningless. You were created intentionally, loved, and given purpose to live eternally. So maybe you are counting the years. Maybe you say, maybe like if I eat well, I'm gonna have like around 10 more years, 20 more years, 30 more years. Maybe if I do exercise, I can have a longer life. Maybe you are looking to the genes of your family and said, "Oh, I have an aunt that lived up to 103, so I know I can make it." But you are not designed to live 100 years. You are not designed to live 90 years, 80. You are designed to live forever. And that's the purpose that God gives you. And Jesus' victory over death shows you that your life matters more than your life here on earth. There is an eternal life for you. There is something else after here. So you have a purpose. And finally, the resurrection gives you power to transform your life today. Bible says that the same power that raised Jesus from death, it's available to you. It's the power to restore broken hearts, to rebuild relationship, and bring hope where it seems hopeless. Your life has meaning today because the resurrection proves it. Also, it gives us hope that one day we're going to see the people who have been separated by death. We're going to meet again. Jesus died because of love. Jesus died because he wanted. He came to die. And you all know John 3:16, that the Father sent his Son out of love to die to save everyone who believes. Jesus rose victorious over death. And because he did, we have assurance that we're going to live forever. That we can win, we can be victorious over death as well, because he did. And Jesus invites you to a new life with him starting today. Viktor Frankl, like a Holocaust survivor, he said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." If you have a purpose in life, you can face anything. The resurrection gives us the best why. Hope that nothing can destroy, even death was conquered. So the good news that I have for you today is that Jesus is alive. He's invited you to believe that he's alive not only by the historical facts, but to step in a life of hope and faith and see what difference this message actually makes in your life. What kind of hope, courage, purpose, and love this message brings to you. If you really believed that Jesus is alive, would it change the ways that you live today? What difference that would make in your life today? Would you live with more hope? With more courage? With more purpose? The tomb is empty. There is no one there because Jesus is alive. And your life can truly begin from this message. I hope that with this good news you can live a life full of hope, boldness, and be transformed by the power that the resurrection brings to all of us. As Victor said, who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow. So if you believe that resurrection is your why, nothing can separate you from Jesus. God bless you.